The Holy Gospel this morning comes from St. Mark in the 8th chapter. Well, then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days, rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." So he called the crowd with his disciples, and he said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. What will it profit them if they gain the whole world, but they forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The gospel of our Lord. You may be seated. This may be one of the hardest things Jesus ever said to his disciples, and not only those folks that lived with him 2,000 years ago, but for you and I who live 2,000 years later. We're not quite sure what we're supposed to do with this Jesus and what he leaves us. Now, whether he knew that he was the Son of Man or not, he certainly knew that his life was in a perilous situation. The very thing that he's talking about here, within 2-3 weeks, he's going to be dead. And he spent most of the last couple years before that time pretty much ticking off everybody that he knew, his former friends, his former colleagues, priests, rabbis, because he was insistent that God was doing something great in the world through each and every one of us. No matter how humble our origins or how great our attainments, the grace of God was flowing through each and every one of us. A love that far transcends anything we can begin to understand or hope to grasp with our minds, with our hearts, or our souls. And so Jesus, after years of this, realized that he had angered just enough people that his end was probably assured. And so as he talked about it, of course, all his friends, Peter in this particular case, said, no, Lord, it's not going to end that way. I won't let it happen. Maybe you have friends like that who, when they see the inevitable, when they see that the loss is coming, they just refuse to give up. They're going to try to the bitter end. And perhaps Peter is one of those guys, never going to give up, never going to succumb. And Jesus says, relax, brother. Stand behind me. You're not thinking about this properly. You're thinking about it in terms of how we think about stuff, not how God thinks about stuff. And when you think about how God thinks about stuff, you got to understand that this world is in a completely different place. That you need to take up your cross for the sake of the gospel and follow me. Now, if you look at that cross, and let's use this one on the back wall, when Jesus says that, of course, you got to remember that everybody only knows the cross as one thing, and that is an instrument of political torture by the Roman people. The only time they saw crosses when somebody was being hanged on them, because the Roman government found them a threat. So it would be akin nowadays if Jesus were here and he said to us, okay, listen, folks, take up your electric chair and follow me. Or take up your water board and follow me. It's an instrument of torture and death. It's not a decoration teenagers wear around their necks. And so for Jesus to say, just pick up the stuff that's going to kill you, the stuff that everybody hates about you, and follow me for the sake of the gospel, was as confusing to Peter and the disciples as it is to you and I. Unless, of course, you remember Good Friday and Easter morning. Because if you remember Good Friday and Easter morning, you know that Jesus, the very one who speaks to say, take up the cross and follow me, does so for the sake of the gospel. God's undying love for each and every one of us, both then and now. You understand that Jesus has transformed this instrument of torture and death and political oppression and power into a symbol of love and mercy, grace and power. So it no longer speaks of despair, but instead it speaks of hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This cross no longer speaks of war, but it speaks of peace through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This cross no longer speaks of hatred, but it now speaks of love through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you and I who take up our cross to follow Jesus for the sake of the gospel, take up the cross that has been transformed by his gracious death and his resurrection into the undying love of God in this life and the next. And the cross that we carry is a deep and abiding love that transcends anything we can imagine, that goes far deeper than anything we can experience in our hearts or even in our souls. You cannot talk about it, you cannot explain it, you cannot reason or rationalize it away. It is an undying love that carries us this day and all days for the rest of time. So pick up your cross and follow Jesus for the sake of the gospel. Which sounds great, except I have no idea how to do that. I mean, I was doing really well until I actually thought about what I just said. How you doing on it? Go okay for you this week? Aren't you thankful we have communion where there's forgiveness? It's going to make Thursday a lot better, I'm sure. I got nothing, Julie. You would think that if Jesus said, hey, pick up your cross, follow me for the sake of the gospel, that something would occur to us somewhere in the last 2,000 years. Somebody would have thought of something. I mean, there's a lot of smart people that have lived. You guys are all here. You're all smart people. Nothing? This is going to be one of the longest sermons ever, Chris. You might as well just keep filming it. How do you take up your cross, follow Jesus for the sake of the gospel? How do you do that? What does that mean? I got a story. Maybe this will help. Almost 30 years ago now, I went on an internship. And I was in a congregation just outside of Cicero, Illinois, which is in Chicago. And it was a good place. They spoke Slovak there, so I had to do half my ministry in Slovak, which was interesting because I didn't know Slovak when I started. Made for some great conversations, very short. I'd only been there a couple of months, and there was this couple, Wally and Millie. And I'd only been there, not even months, it was weeks actually, and she had gone to the doctor, and she was diagnosed with a rather rampant form of Alzheimer's disease. Nobody wants to hear that. Now, they'd been married for 40-some years, and Wally had recently retired from the phone company as a lineman, and so to have his wife, his beloved, be diagnosed with Alzheimer's was kind of shocking, not only to them, but to everybody at the congregation. So, not too long after the diagnosis, they came into my office, and Millie sat down, and she said, Father, she said, I'm worried. And I said, okay, what are you worried about? She said, well, I'm worried about Wally. And Wally said, there's nothing wrong with me. Fair enough. I said, well, what are you worried about? And she said, well, you might not know this, but we don't have any children. Never had children. I said, oh, okay. And she said, and even more strange is that neither one of us have any brothers or sisters. It's just Wally and me. And I'm worried that Wally will try to take care of me as this Alzheimer's continues to get worse. And I said, well, Wally, how do you feel about that? And he said, I'm perfectly fine. She's worried for no reason. I can do this. Now, sitting there, after you've been a lineman for 45 years for the phone company, your health isn't always been in the most ideal of conditions. And Wally'd had a couple of, heart surgeries, had a new hip, those types of things. And, but all in all, for a guy in his mid to late 60s, he looked pretty good. He said, Scott, don't worry about me. I can do this. I said, okay. So, over the course of my internship, it was actually a treat to see Wally and Millie. Now, they came to church for just about everything. They wouldn't have missed a dogfight if we'd have put one in there, so they were always around. But they would come to church, and they were always together, and, Millie no longer drove, so Wally was always driving and escorting her here and there and making sure. And indeed, the Alzheimer's that Millie had was fairly rampant and virulent, and by the time I left, unless I was dressed in an albanah robe, Millie didn't know who I was. Millie was part of a circle at the church that met once a month for Bible study and coffee and things like that with other women of the church. And she came every month, even though she didn't remember even some of those people or why she was there. And Wally would always come and sit in my office while she was at circle, and he and I would tell stories and various other things and talk and have coffee ourselves. And I'd ask him how things were going, and he said it would fine, and they would be just great. And so I had to leave my internship after a year, go back to school. And as I was leaving, Millie and Wally came up to me, and Millie wished me really well and thought I would be a really good intern, and that she was excited to get a chance to meet me and to work with me over the next year. But that's Alzheimer's. You always think your ending is your beginning is your ending, and so on. Wally, on the other hand, he gave me a big hug, and he gave me an envelope that had enough money in it to cover all my tuition and expenses for my last year of seminary. So I went to seminary. Got my first job as a pastor on the north side of Chicago, where Chicago borders the state of Wisconsin. Right there, I lived there. But a few years later, I got an invitation to the 125th anniversary of Saints Peter and Paul Lutheran Church. Now, it just so happened that the intern that came after me at that particular congregation is the godfather of my youngest daughter, Madeline. And he and his wife and Chris and I both had received those invitations, and we decided it had been 4 or 5 years since we'd been to that congregation. We should go to this anniversary. So we did. And at the anniversary, it was a wonderful, wonderful party. They were celebrating 125 years. They had this great worship. They had a wonderful dinner full of traditional Czech and Slovak foods and whatnot. It was just a great time. And there were pictures of the history of this church all around. And I was walking through the pictures, and I was with the woman who had been in the head of the altar guild while I was there. Her name was Joan. And her and I were walking, and we got to a picture, and there was a little photo of Wally and Millie. And I said to Joan, I said, "Oh, Wally, Millie, whatever happened to them?" And Joan grabbed my arm and she said, "Oh, Scott, it was the most beautiful thing we've ever seen." I said, "Really?" She said, "Oh, Scott, he would take her, and there were points where she couldn't even walk towards the end, and he would almost literally carry her to the pew each Sunday morning, and he would hold her hand, and they would flip through the hymnal together and try to sing the songs." She said you could just see him just constantly doting on her and checking her hair and arranging her dresses and making sure that she was as beautiful then as she was when he first met her. I said, "Wow." She said, "Oh." I said, "Well, I don't see him here. What happened?" And she said, "Oh." Eventually, he said, Millie got so bad she had to be completely hospitalized in a locked ward. She couldn't take care of herself, and Wally, of course, got sicker and sicker, and he couldn't do it, and broke his heart. She said, then, a couple days later, Wally had a heart attack and he died. I said, "He died?" She goes, "Yeah." And he said, and 2 weeks after that, Millie died as well. Driving back home that night, it occurred to me that you can't explain that kind of love. There are no definitions, pictures, dictionaries, or thesauruses big enough and thick enough to explain that kind of love. Jesus says, "Follow me," and we do. And I don't pretend to know where your journey with Jesus will lead you. I do know that your journey will continue on even when you die. But I do know that when you pick up that cross, that kind of love that Wally had for his wife, you can never set it down. You carry that love with you for the rest of your life and the next. You carry that love for the sake of the gospel.